With the Civil War and abolitionist movement so far behind us, slavery in the United States might seem like nothing more than a tragic chapter in world history. And with so many salacious headlines constantly in front of us these days, from the James Bond fantasies of President Trump's Russian connections to quickly multiplying allegations of sexual harassment in Hollywood and the halls of Congress, it's been easy to miss the scattered headlines here and there out of Libya, one of NATO's more recent experiments in nation building. So in case you missed it, it appears that the human slave trade is back on and on the rise in the North African country, and actually thriving as modern-day slavers capture and auction off migrants and refugees. And the situation has apparently reached such a dire level that migrants would rather risk a Mediterranean voyage fraught with Navy blockades, pirates, and sharks rather than await a near certain fate of hard labor, brutal abuse, and likely death. To explore this crisis and how exactly we've arrived at it, we were earlier joined by Robin Philpot, publisher of Slouching Towards SIRTE, NATO's War on Libya and Africa, and an expert in African history and politics.
Everything that we're seeing today in these horrific films of the resurgence of a slave trade in 2017, it could have been foreseen if somebody looked at that book and what the author managed to describe what was going on in Libya, and also what the people who NATO and our countries, the United States, Canada, or European countries, the people we were supporting were already showing their colors in 2011. And you might say that we could have seen this developing from the late 1990s. Muammar Gaddafi made it very clear that Libya was committed to Africa, was committed to African unity, and that was the founding meeting of the African Union was in Sirte in 1999. And in that meeting, and it was attended by most of the African countries, and he made it very clear that the future in Africa was based on 3 points. We would have an African monetary fund in order to enable economic independence of African countries. And he would put his money where the mouth was, you might say. He invested billions in African countries in support of this idea of an African monetary fund. Then he called African justice. He said there will not be an international criminal court that will come and try Africans. It will be an African court in cases of war crimes or crimes against humanity. And then he talked about African security would be ensured by African troops. There would be no non-African troops on the continent. Now, this was a very important declaration and widely supported. But within Libya, within a year, there were anti-black and anti-black African riots in certain areas of Libya. And Gaddafi managed to put it down, but I would say that was the sign that there were people in that country who were opposed to Gaddafi, who were opposed to this support of Africa. They wanted to use the money from the oil for their own interests. And you could say that was a sign that what we're seeing now was already developing. And then in 2011, when the so-called Arab Spring began, there were already signs of racial scapegoating in the Benghazi area in particular. That was where our insurgents, as we would say, our insurgents, our rebels in this Arab Spring were active, and they were scapegoating and even attacking black Libyans. And some of them are black Libyans, some are black Africans who were working. They're just workers in the area, and they were being scapegoated. This was February 2011. So you can see where this came from. And it's also important to remember that the main pretext for a no-fly zone, which they carefully mutated into a regime change and assassination of Muammar Gaddafi, the main pretext was a great lie. You could say fake news, real fake news. That is the case of when they said that Gaddafi was importing black African mercenaries to attack the people of Benghazi. and they used all this sexual image as well. That was what led the International Criminal Court, who was sort of like running interference for NATO, to say we're going to indict Gaddafi for giving Viagra to these mercenaries. This is fake news at its worst.
Wow, that is incredible.
Yeah, and you know, all the major media took the story and ran with it. I mean, I'm here in Canada, the Globe and Mail, the New York Times, and many others just kept telling the story, and there was absolutely no grounds for this story. Yet that was a pretext given to vote for a no-fly zone over Libya, and then NATO was here to apply that resolution, which turned into a massive bombing campaign and the final assassination of Muammar Gaddafi. And then you can see where all this came from.
Yes, you can. Yes, you can.
The National Transition Council, and interrupt me if you go right ahead, National Transition Council, which was the people who took over, while NATO was still bombing, made it clear that the new Libya was very much against African migrants, which also meant black Libyans, who are Libyan citizens. And they were going to change. The new Libya would break with its policy of African unity. African diplomats in Tripoli were being attacked. They were not being protected. The government and the army of the former Libyan administration could not protect the black population in Libya, and there are old Libyan black communities. There's one called Tawarga, which is east of Tripoli, where they were being massacred, and people were saying, we are going to reduce the blacks to a situation of slavery. I mean, there are quotes in Max Forte's book about that, saying that we were going to, they were not going to be allowed to go to schools, they were not going to have access to health care, which in essence makes it into a new kind of slavery. So all the signs were there before. So it is not a surprise what is going on now. And I think we should start looking for who the people are responsible for this.
Well, and there's so many, because when you look at it, you know, this was sold at least to the American public and I think to the world as this humanitarian effort with no thought to sort of how it goes. And the one question that keeps coming up since NATO countries began getting involved in the internal Middle East conflicts like Libya and Syria is, whose side are we on? Whose side is who on? Who's fighting side by side with who? And one of the questions I want to ask you is that this sort of question came up front and center when a cell of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which the U.S. and the U.K. supported in that 2011 civil war, carried out the Manchester concert attack earlier this year. With that in mind, I have to ask you, are we bound to see blowback from this kind of taking sides in conflicts, where we're giving arms to one, it's, you know, the enemy of my enemy is my enemy?
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Are we going to expect more of that?
Well, I absolutely. People can expect more of that. If you trace that group, they were originally recruited and developed, like Al-Qaeda, to go and fight the Soviet Union in Afghanistan in the early, like it was in the 80s and early 90s. Then they were demobilized, you could say, and they came back, and Muammar Gaddafi really kept them in tow, kept them, you know, like he was even congratulated in some cases for his fight against Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda allies, like the group you mentioned. So, but then you see what happens. Gaddafi represented a rampart against certain imperial interests in Africa. You could say the war against Gaddafi was one for domination of Africa because of this position which I described earlier. So people were prepared to ally with them. It was very, very short-sighted. And it has created havoc in Libya. We know that some of the people you're talking about, the attack in Manchester, but they were also in Libya, which in fact they were joined with the ISIS in Libya, in Syria. the flare-ups of jihadi attacks in West Africa, including Mali, I think are a direct result of removing Gaddafi. So, you know, I would say that the countries responsible, their goal, I mean, you could say France, the UK, and the United States in particular. Canada was in there too. I want to mention it because I'm living here in Canada. Their goal was chaos. I would say that the goal is chaos. And one of the results of chaos there is also what you call, what you said, described as a blowback.
When NATO, led by expert interventionists Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, led the humanitarian mission to assist the Arab Spring movement in 2011, Libya was supposed to have been the layup for the Western world's military coalition. Having set their sights on a dictator readily painted by the mainstream media correctly as corrupt and brutal, and with the right side of history talking points at the ready, the Libya project seemed to be target practice for NATO. Well, perhaps a few alarm bells might have gone off when freedom-fighting militias in Benghazi burned down the U.S. embassy and killed 4 Americans. But perhaps when Libya, now Gaddafi-less and rudderless, became effectively a Wild West beach resort for both ISIS and al-Qaeda, or perhaps finally now, as video emerges showing genuine, all-too-real slave auctions. Yes, slave auctions taking place in Libya with refugees, migrants, and non-Arab Libyans sold off like cattle for just a few $100s. So who benefits from this mess? And why did Washington take such an active part in creating it? For answers to that and more, we were joined earlier by publisher and regional expert Robin Philpot.
One of the things I ask you is if their goal was to remove Gaddafi from where he wanted to, you know, bring Africa together and make it a more unified continent with, you know, a central currency and things of that nature. Now you have this chaos, and you have blowback happening and all of that since the fall of Gaddafi, and now you have the slave trades in Libya. Was that, in your opinion and in your research and your expertise, was that was that chaos and this kind of destabilization of Africa, was that on purpose, and how does that benefit places like the U.S., the U.K.? Why would that benefit them to create this much chaos in Africa?
Well, the benefit is that nobody contests their presence. You know, Africa and Gaddafi, in one of his speeches, I was just going over it in preparation for this interview, he kept pointing out the wealth there is in Africa. But very little of that wealth actually remains in Africa. It's a lot of natural resources. And his policy, and I think if we're looking for the future, his policy was any aid has to lead to increased wealth in Africa. That means value added, you know, like a secondary and tertiary transformation of natural resources. And if you look at the way the countries I mentioned operate in Africa, it's the opposite. Their so-called aid is only to aid their economies. And so Gaddafi's removal, for instance, I mean, you look at France. If they were able to create a currency, an African currency, and Gaddafi had the means to do so, it would have taken the whole of the West Africa, French-speaking West Africa, out of the French zone. Those countries like France don't want to give that up easily. And the United States operates in the same way. It does not want to have strong states who operate independently. And so whether on purpose, nobody, I don't think, was actually aiming to create slavery again. That was not part of the goal. The goal was to ensure that American, British, and French interests would be protected and would be continued to develop freely, without a state which was saying, well, no, we're not going to do that. Maybe we'll deal with China, maybe we'll deal just with ourselves, and an empire does not like that.
No, it does not. No, it does not.
That sounds a lot like colonialism to me.
Well, in fact, if you look at the title of the book that I wrote, and it's not particularly about Libya, but North Africa, Rwanda, and the new scramble for Africa, we are in the process of what you could call a recolonization of Africa.
Yeah.
And I'd like to mention that one of the things in the future, we have to start respecting national sovereignty, respecting the will of countries to work independently. You have the case of Burundi, a very small country, but has decided to pull out of the International Criminal Court and to be independent, to work independently. And the spokesman for the president, who I interviewed for a radio program I do in French, said we are currently watching an attempt to recolonize Africa. And that's what I think what the official story about Rwanda has become that as well. So you could say that the Libyan, the overthrowing of and assassination of Muammar Gaddafi was a major step in this recolonization. It may not be have the same image that it did after 1885 when they scrambled for Africa and divided it up, but essentially that is what's going on.
Wow. What do you feel is when you I want to ask too, like where does this, what can we do basically? We're seeing a lot of the underlying problems aside. What could the U.S. and others do watching this program, things like this, to try to help bring that sovereignty back to Africa? Because I think you're right. I think we all can sit here and agree and say, what, at the end of the day, those countries should be allowed to reach their own ends and their own conclusions and where they need to go, rather than having once again more colonialism put upon them. What can viewers do to help kind of stymie those efforts, even in their own? If I'm looking and saying, wow, we've got the Clintons and we have other people involved in this kind of thing. We have our politicians pushing one certain agenda. What can we do to kind of curb that if we want to allow Africa to chart its own future?
Yeah, well, among other things, what they could do is follow on what President Obama said. Libya was his worst mistake. I think he should get a lot more penalty than actually saying I made a mistake. But you make a mistake, then you've got to say, how do we correct this? Well, I would say the place to start is to see what Muammar Gaddafi said back in 1999, and which he said in very close consultation with Nelson Mandela. Now, we all say we love Nelson Mandela. Mandela and Gaddafi were very close, and they had this Pan-African vision, one from South Africa and the other from North Africa. And the principle was you be independent countries, but independent economically. You do have African justice. In other words, I would say the first thing to do is put an end to the International Criminal Court. It's a case of, it's a Get Africa court. It's essentially been that. If they want to go after justice, the people they have to go after are Cameron from the UK, Sarkozy from France, and Obama and Hillary Clinton. They're the ones who created they were the ones who created the situation in Libya currently. So I would say any aid has to be of aid to the economy in the country it is supposedly destined, and not an aid to the so-called donor country. And if you carefully examine all the projects in so-called coming from donor countries, they are done to help the donor country's own economy. And I'm sorry, that just doesn't work that way, that, either one or the other. So if there's going to be aid, then it has to be towards developing economic independence of these countries and not dependence, which has been the case for as long as I remember. So there are 3 points. One is justice, he said, African justice, African economy, and African security. If you start counting, and I lost count of it, but the different places in Africa where there are European and American troops. It's mind-boggling.
It truly is. It definitely is when you see the amount of bases and all of that, you know, taking place there, and again, U.S. military presence and other militaries from around the world also still, you know, there, and that kind of, like you said, that new colonialism. I think we can all agree that Africa should be left to find its own future. Robin, I want to thank you so much for coming on today and talking about this with us, and look forward to having you on again in the future to talk about the issues facing Africa today.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much.